Hiya! Today we will make a space scene in Photoshop. I'll break the project up into parts, starting with a planet with a ring around it, a supernova, then we'll move on to a star field with a nebula or a gas cloud, and then finally we'll put all the pieces together and add some touch-ups to create one cohesive piece. So the first part that we're going to work on is the planet. The first step in making the planet is finding a texture you want to work with. Now you can either work from a texture that you've painted yourself, like I have down here. You can work from a texture where you don't have to do a lot of editing to it. Stone textures work really well for making planets. Or you can even just grab a photo that has colors in it you want to use. And it doesn't take much to edit these to make them good planet textures. So let's take this photo up here. I don't have to do much to actually edit this to make it appropriate to wrap around a planet. All I have to do for this is just go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur, make sure my angle is going left to right here, and then I just mess with the distance until I get a texture I want to use. That makes it look a little less like rocks and more kind of like a gas giant might look. So I kind of like that texture. So once I have it looking the way I want to, I'll just hit OK. And similar to what I do for this one, now you can see just unedited, that wouldn't look very realistic for a planet. But if I do the filter, blur, motion blur, and I just keep changing the settings until I get a nice good streak. You can see now it doesn't really look like how we started it, and I've got a nice good blend of colors here. To make my planet, I'm going to use this texture right here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my elliptical marquee tool, and I'm going to hold Option and Shift on my keyboard. If you're on a Windows computer, it'll be Alt-Shift, and that allows me to make a perfect circle that expands from the middle. And I'm not going to go all the way to the edge of my image here. I'm going to stop a little beforehand because I don't want any flat edges on my planet. I'm just going to go as big as I can without making any clips. And now once I've selected the area that I want to use, I'm going to go to Filter, Distort, and Spherize. And I'm just going to crank this up all the way to 100%, make sure the mode is normal, and then when I hit OK, you can see it distorts it into more of a sphere shape. Now depending on what kind of texture you're using or how it looks, you may need to go up and do Spherize twice. It depends on how distorted you want it to look. But once I have that looking the way I want to, I'm going to right click and hit Layer via Copy. If you don't see these options when you right click, just make sure you have the marquee tool still selected, or if you have the lasso tool, it'll bring these options up as well. But I'm just going to hit Layer via Copy, and now I have my planet cut out from the original image. Now if you want to keep this image around just in case you make a mistake, you can. I'm just going to go ahead and trash the layer because it doesn't take that much to edit the photo back to what I need it to be. Once I have the planet body set up, I'm just going to use my free transform tool to make it a little bit smaller so that way I have some room to work. So I'm going to go ahead and add some rings to it. Now the way I'm going to do the rings is I'm going to make a new layer, and then I'm going to find my gradient tool. If you don't see it, the shortcut for it's going to be G on your keyboard. If it brings up the paint bucket tool or the 3D material drop instead, just hold Shift and keep hitting G until the gradient tool shows up. And I want some ring colors that are really close together, so I'm just going to edit this a bit more to get the effects that I want. And you can make your own gradient. If you want to add a slider, you just click in this area below the bar here, and you can add as many sliders as you want. But once you're happy with how your gradient looks, you can go ahead and just hit OK. Make sure the gradient is set to radial, which is that second option up here. And just make sure that your mode is set to normal and your opacity is 100%. And then I'm just going to place my gradient down on that new layer we just made. And it's going to make it big enough so that way I can get some good rings out of it. There we go. I'll call that good. Now I'm going to go back to my elliptical marquee tool. I'm going to go to the center here, and then I'm going to hold either Option or Alt and Shift. And I'm going to go out to the farthest part here. And then I'm going to right click, select Inverse. And once this outer part's selected, I'm just going to go ahead and hit Delete. And then if you just want a very simple ring, you would just go in back to the center, hold Alt or Option and Shift. Go as big as you want your middle to be. And then once you have this area selected, you just hit Delete. And you have your ring set up. I kind of want to have multiple rings going on, so I'm just going to cut this up a little bit more. Okay, once you have your rings set up the way you want them to look, just make sure they're merged all into one layer afterwards. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to resize this using my free transform tool. I'm going to hold either Command or Control T. And I want to squash this down, but in newer versions of Photoshop, in order to change the size of something unproportionally, you're going to have to hold Shift while you're doing it. So I'm going to grab this top square here, and holding Shift, I'm just going to drag down, and it squashes the rings down and kind of forces the perspective a bit to make them look like they're lying flat. And then holding Shift again, I'm just going to widen these rings out a bit. And then I'm just using my move tool to place it where I need it to be and resizing it as needed. If you want, if you select both layers while you have the move tool selected, it'll bring up some align options for you. So that'll help you kind of center everything where it needs to go. You can see while the rings look like they're flat now, this back part should be behind the planet here. So what I'm going to do is, while holding either Control or Command, depending on whether you have a Windows or Mac computer, I'm going to click on the thumbnail for my planet body, and you'll see it'll make a selection of that planet. And what that will allow me to do is, with the rings selected, I'm going to add a mask to them. I'm going to add a mask to them, which is this button down here. It's the rectangle with a hole in it. I'm just going to hit that. And because I had that selection done, it made a mask, so that way everything I had selected was what you were seeing. But I actually want to flip this around. So with the mask selected, and you can tell the mask is selected because it has these white lines around the corners. If I had this one selected, you can see the white lines move. But with the mask selected, you're going to hit either Command or Control I, and it just inverts the mask. That way what was white is now black, and what's black is now white. And I still want this front part of the ring to be in front of the planet, so I'm just going to grab my brush. Make sure the opacity is set to 100. And what's white is what we're going to see, and what's black is what it's going to hide. So I'm just going to make my foreground color white. And I'm just going to go in and paint in that front ring again. Make sure you don't go too high up and accidentally paint this part back in. We just want the front of the rings to show up. Now we could have also just erased this back part, but I like using masks because you can see if I went to maybe add like a weird ring effect where there were like multiple rings going up and down. If I move this further down, you can see that the edges don't match up anymore. If I had just deleted that section, then that information is just gone and there's nothing I can do about it. But because I have a mask, I can just go in and paint in more of the information I need. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. And then I'm going to save this. Now that I have this file saved, I'm going to move on to the next part, which is a kind of supernova. So I'm just going to make a new document. I'm just going to make it 8x8, 300. I'm going to make a black background on it so that way I can easily see what I'm doing. And since space is black, that'll let me see what it looks like when we add it to the entire scene. Once I'm happy with it, I'm going to go ahead and hit create. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new layer. With that new layer, I'm going to make sure that my foreground and background colors are set to black and white. If you hit D on your keyboard, that's D as in dog, that will set your foreground and background colors to the default, which is black and white. And on this new layer, I'm going to go to Filter, Render, and Fibers. And just kind of mess with these settings until you get what you want. What we're looking for is we want kind of some really strong streaks of the black, so that way it's pretty even compared to the white. And the vibrance is going to kind of change how long some of these fibers are, or these streaks. I think that looks good. I might bring that down to 15. Once I'm happy with it, I'm just going to hit OK. And then I'm going to add an adjustment layer and go to levels. And I'm just going to change these so that way the blacks are really strong and the whites are really bright. And there's not a whole lot of gray tone going on. Something a bit like that. Then I'm going to right click and merge down, and that will apply the adjustment to the layer. Then I'm going to use my free transform tool, which is either Command or Control T. And I'm going to hold Alt or Option, and I'm just going to make this really big. Just so that way it expands a little further out of the canvas. And I'm going to rotate it 45 degrees. And if you need to, just make it big enough so that way it covers the whole canvas. And then I'm going to grab the layer that has the fibers on them, duplicate it, and then I'm going to hit Command T again, and I'm just going to reflect this horizontally so that way the dashes are going in the opposite direction. And then on this top layer, I'm going to go to the blending mode and change it to vivid light. And then I'm just going to right click and merge down again to make this one layer. Now I'm going to go to Filter, Distort, and Twirl. And I'm just going to zoom out a bit so I can see what I'm doing. And the more you go left or right, you can see the more it twists our image here. I don't want to go all the way to the end because it gets a bit too distorted. But somewhere around 700 usually works well. Then I'm just going to hit OK. You can see it creates this nice swirl effect. Now I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. So I can get more swirl. And then I'm going to grab my elliptical marquee tool. Except this time I'm going to add a feather to it. So I'm going to add about 100 pixels in the feather. And I'm going to get as close to the middle as I can here. And again, holding either Alt or Option plus Shift, I'm just going to drag outward until I get most of what I want. Remember, because of this feather, it's going to create a soft edge, so you don't want to get too close to the edge, otherwise you'll get like this hard cutoff on your selection. And if you need to move it, you can nudge it using your arrow keys, or as long as you have that elliptical marquee tool selected, you can just grab it and move it to where you need it to go without it moving any information. So once you're happy with it, just right click, layer via cut. And if we get rid of this layer, you see we have a nice swirl with a fuzzy edge to it. Now once I have this, you can see when I turn off that black background, there are big chunks of black in there. Now, like I said earlier, space is black, but later on we will be adding a star field and a nebula cloud. And those aren't going to show through these black gaps the way we have it set up now. So with this layer selected, I'm going to go to Select, Color Range. And this lets you pick a specific color in your artwork. You can either use the eyedropper tool to pick what you want it to select, or you can go in here into the drop down menu and select what you want. I'm going to select highlights, that way it grabs the whites. And then I want most of the spiral in there. And you can see the more I change these, the more right I go, the less I get, because it's very specific that it only wants pure white. But if I go too far, then I'm getting too much of the spiral and I'm going to get some black parts. So I'm going to go to where it's mostly still white, but there's still enough give that's picking up a lot of the spiral. So I'm going to say 160, fuzziness of 25%, and then I'm going to hit OK. And you can see it makes this nice selection for us. And then I'm just going to make a new layer. Get rid of this layer with a spiral on it. And then with my paint bucket tool, again, it's going to be the same in the same spot as the gradient tool. You might just have to right click on it to find the paint bucket. I'm going to select white, and then I'm just going to fill this in with white, and if I hit either Control or Command D, you can see I've got the spiral, but there's some nice empty spaces in between it. Once I have this spiral set up the way I want to, I'm going to double click on it. I'm going to add a gradient overlay, and I'm going to pick some colors I want on top of this. Now, you can either pick some of the presets that are already in here, or if you just click on the colors here, you can make your own custom color group. Once you're happy with the look, you can just hit OK. And then we're going to right click, rasterize layer style. And then we're going to use our free transform tool, which is either Command or Control T. Then I'm going to hold Shift and squish this down like we did with the planet rings. Once we have our galaxy here, I'm going to make a couple copies, so that way I have 3. And then on this top layer here, I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. And this time I'm going to make sure the angle is going up and down, so -90. And I just want to make this so that way there's a kind of glow going up and down. We don't want to go too far because then it kind of just blows it out and makes it too blurry, but somewhere between 100 and 200 will work. Then I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to change this blending mode to linear dodge add, so that way it just makes the colors pop, especially against this dark background. Then I'm going to go to this middle layer here. So I'm just going to go to Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. And this time I'm just going to go a little bit more than what I already had. Not by too much, just a little bit. And I'm going to hit OK. And this time we're going to set the blending mode to dissolve. And you can see it creates this kind of grainy look. And if we go to opacity, rather than making it transparent, what it does is it actually just lessens the amount of grains that are there. So just kind of keep messing with it until you get a look you like. You don't want it too busy, so don't leave it at 100%. Usually somewhere 50 and below is what you want. Again, it kind of depends on the pattern of your spiral and how big it is. And then I'm going to use my free transform tool on this middle layer here. Again, that's Command or Control T. And holding either Alt or Option, I'm just going to make this a smudge bigger just so that dissolve is a little bit offset from the other 2 layers. Not by too much, you just want a smidge bigger. And now I'm going to make a new layer again. And this layer needs to be on the very top. And then with my brush, I'm just going to set it to white. I'm going to make sure the hardness is set to 0. And I'm going to make a brush that's kind of big enough to fit in the center there. The size will change depending on your particular spiral, but just get something that fits in the center. Once you're happy with it, we're just going to put a white fuzzy dot in the middle. If you want, you can use your free transform tool to make it bigger or smaller, but just put it in the middle there. And if you need to, you can select all your layers and then use those align tools with the move tool still selected. Now what we want is we want this to look like it's bursting out of the middle of the spiral here, but the spiral is technically a flat plane, and what we want is to make it look like this white burst of light here is coming out both sides of the plane. But from our angle, the way this is set up, we're going to see more of the top than we are the bottom. So in order to do that, with the layer with the white dot selected, I'm going to add a mask to it. And you won't notice a change immediately because we didn't have a selection for it. But I'm just going to use my paintbrush, and I'm going to make sure it has a nice soft edge to it, so the hardness set to 0. And what I'm going to do is, using black, I'm just going to paint in to make it look like some of the white light is submerged underneath this spiral here. And I'm using a low opacity so that way it's not too harsh. And I'm just going to go in and just kind of streak this up so that way it looks like it's hiding underneath the spiral. And remember, black hides things and white reveals it. So if you need to go in and add a bit more, you just switch to white and just paint in what you need to add. And I'm just using a low opacity brush with a soft edge to it. Once it kind of looks like part of the light is hiding underneath your spiral here, I'm going to make a new layer and I'm going to fill this in with black. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Render, and Lens Flare. And you've got a bunch of different light types that you can pick from. Pick whichever one you think looks best. The important thing is the brightness. Now, you don't want it so bright that the light reaches the end of your canvas. You want it bright that you have a nice little hot spot, but you don't want any part of the light to reach the edges of your canvas. So like this one wouldn't be a good one to pick because that blue line reaches the edge of your canvas, and when we go to add it to the bigger space scene, you're going to be able to tell where the canvas for the galaxy ends. So I think I'm going to go with the first option, 80%, just hit OK. Then I'm going to go to the blending mode, and I'm going to make this linear dodge add. And I kind of don't like how that hard ring is there, so I'm just going to go to Filter, Blur, and Gaussian Blur to kind of soften that highlight a little bit more. You may not have to blur it depending on what type of lens flare you're using and depending on what look you want, but I don't like those hard rings there. So I'm just going to soften them up a bit. And I'll hit OK when I'm done. And now I have my galaxy and I just have to save it. Now I'm going to go and show you how to do a star field and a nebula. So I'm just going to go to File, New. And for this one, it's going to be the canvas that we'll put everything together on. So I'm going to change the layout to 11 by 8.5. You can switch yours around so that way it's 8.5 by 11 depending on what orientation you want. I'm going to do this landscape. The important thing on this one to look out for is make sure your color mode is set to RGB. There is a effect that we're going to use and it only works with RGB color. And just make sure the resolution is set to 300. And then make the background contents black. That will just save us from having to use the paint bucket tool to fill in the canvas. Once you're happy with it, just hit create. And then I'm immediately going to make a brand new layer. And I'm going to set my foreground color to white. And I'm going to grab my brush. And there is actually a specific brush in the legacy set. If you don't have these legacy brushes, just go to your options in the brushes menu and just select legacy and it will add that folder for you. These have all of the old brushes from like the really old versions of Photoshop. So I'm going to go to legacy brushes, assorted, and I'm going to scroll down until I find starburst. So there's starburst small and starburst large. Either one of them will work. Pick whichever one you like more. I like the small starburst a little bit better. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my brush settings. If you can't find this menu, just go to Window and Brush Settings. And I'm going to turn on some settings in here. First, I'm going to set it to be linked to the pen pressure in my pen, and then I'm going to change the size jitter to 100%. That just means every time it lays down a new star, it will slightly change the size of it. And I'm going to change the angle jitter, which will change the angle of each star, and that will keep them from looking a little too uniform. And then I'm going to turn on scattering and turn on both axes. And then I'm going to bring the scatter up. I'm also going to bring up the count jitter, so that way there's some parts that get clumped together, but some parts that are a bit more spaced out. You don't have to crank these all the way to the ends. You can bring them a little bit in, but my brush is still kind of clumping up more than I want, so I'm going to go to brush tip shape, and I'm just going to change the spacing a little bit more. I think that'll give me a good layout. Now first off is I want a really small brush. I'm just going to test it a couple times until they're small, but they're still big enough that I can kind of see the starburst. I think that'll be good. Just make sure your opacity is set to 100. So I'm going to go in and lay in my really small stars. I'm just going to just paint all over the canvas here. Remember, stars aren't usually aligned with each other, so don't kind of just go up, down, up, down, up, down. Try and paint your stars in different directions so that way they don't look so uniform and you're not going to have even empty spaces. And if you pack your stars in too tight, you can always go in with your eraser and erase some of these stars. Just when you do it, make sure you use a soft edge brush. That way it's just a little bit less obvious that you went in and erased some gaps. And you can also go in with a lower opacity, so that way some stars are dimmer than others. And it will look like those ones are slightly more far away. Once you've added in the really teeny tiny pinprick stars, I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger so that way I can definitely see the starbursts. And I'm not going to go hog wild like I did with the little stars. I'm just going to kind of place a few here and there around the canvas. You want it to look as random as possible. And again, if you need to, you can always go back in with the eraser and erase some of these. Once you're happy with it, that's our star field. Next is we're going to move on to the nebula or the gas cloud. And I'm going to make a brand new layer. And I'm going to make sure that my foreground and background colors are set to black and white. And I'm going to go to Filter, Render, Clouds. You can see it creates this texture for me. And I'm going to go and change the blending mode to color dodge. Now when you change the blending mode, the clouds should disappear. If they don't disappear, then that probably means your color profile is wrong, and you'll have to go to image mode and just make sure it's set to RGB color. This effect doesn't work with CMYK, so if you have CMYK turned on, instead you're still going to see your clouds when you change that blending mode to color dodge. Make sure it's set to RGB color. So I'm going to name these so that way you guys can see what I'm doing a little easier. Then I'm going to make a brand new layer, and I'm going to drag it underneath my cloud layer. This is where my colors are going to go. And I'm going to switch my brush to a nice round, soft brush. Nothing fancy. Then I'm going to pick a color I want to use. Usually you want to pick the nice bright ones. And before I start painting, I'm going to use a really low opacity, and I mean really low, like around 1%. And what that allows me to do is I can go in and start painting in my cloud, and you can see that the texture from this cloud layer is showing through when I paint in my colors, and I can actually pick some different ones and mix them together, and I can get some pretty cool effects. And because I already have that texture from the clouds, it's already adding some highlights and shadows for me, and it's giving that cloud look without me having to put in too much work. Be careful on your opacity. You're usually not going to want to use more than 5%. If you were to use 100%, this is what it would look like. You can see it looks really bright and fried. So make sure your opacity is set to 5% or lower. I usually keep it around 1%. This might be the point where you maybe want to look up some reference images to kind of see how these look and kind of how the colors blend together. So you can either paint it according to a reference, or you can freehand it, creating your own look. It just depends on what you want for the overall composition. And it can take up as much or as little of the canvas as you want. Alright, now that I'm happy with it, I'm just going to save it. And now I'm going to go ahead and add in those elements that we made earlier with the planet and the galaxies. So I'm just going to go to my planet. I'm going to select both of these layers, and I'm going to put them in a group. That group button is that folder next to the new layer button. I'm going to hit that and put everything into a group, and then I'm just going to name that planet so it's easy to find when I move it into the bigger project. I'm going to right click, hit duplicate group, and then under where it says destination and next to document, instead of having it have this document be the destination, I'm going to change this to my space scene that has the star field and the gas cloud. And now when I hit OK, if I go over here, you'll see it's added my planet to the scene. So we're going to do the same thing with the galaxy. We're going to put everything except this black layer into a group. So you see I have everything selected except this black layer, and then I'm going to hit group. I'm going to name it, and then I'm going to hit right click, duplicate group, and under destination next to document, I'm going to change that to my space scene, and I'm going to hit OK. And if I go over here, my galaxy's been added. So now I can go in and start moving things around. If you have an issue where you grab your move tool and instead of moving the entire group, it's just grabbing one part of it, what you can do is up in the top here, just make sure auto select is turned off, and then just select them in your layers panel to move them around. So you can rotate them, you can resize them. I'm just going to go back to my colors layer and fix this up a bit more. So I'm just going to add any tweaks that I need. Now, if you need to, you can even change the color of some of your stuff. For instance, if I want to change the color of my rings here, an easy way to do that is just add a layer style to it. Either add a gradient or a color overlay, depending on what you want. And then just kind of change the blending mode on it to get whatever effect you want, or if you want to change the color of it, you can just do color overlay. You can also add a layer style to an entire group. So if you need to, you can actually change the color. So for instance, you find you want to change the color of your supernova. You can go into the group, and an easy way to change the colors on these is to just add a layer style to whatever element you want to change. And you can also add adjustment layers if you want to. You would just have to make sure that you go back and make them a clipping mask, so that way they only affect the layer directly underneath them and not your whole project. And you can also add layer styles to an entire group as well. So go ahead and add in whatever edits you want to make to the project. In fact, why don't you go ahead and add another object? You can either add in like a spaceship, another planet, whatever you want. Just try not to copy and paste other elements, because it will be very easy to tell that you just copied and pasted something. So if you're going to make another planet, try and use a different texture for the planet. Maybe make it without any rings. You can add like a moon. You can maybe add a few more supernovas that are different colors, maybe different swirl patterns. Just change it up however you want. Okay, so now I have everything laid out the way I want to. You can still see that everything looks a bit flat, and that's because I have this really bright light source in the center, but all of my planets and moons are very one tone. So I'm going to go in and add some shadows to them. So I'm going to add a shadow to this one here, and a real easy way to add some shading to it is I'm going to select this layer, hit Command or Control on your keyboard, and then click on the thumbnail that you want to add a shadow to the planet, And then with that selection still made, make a new layer. And go ahead and add a mask on that layer. And now if we select the layer and set the color to black, get a nice big fuzzy brush, I can go in and just paint in the shadow, just always keeping in mind where my light source is. So you might be painting your shadow in a little bit differently depending on where the brightest spot in your piece is. And if you're having trouble getting the black applied to your planet, just make sure that you have the layer selected and not the mask. You can also change the blending mode if you want, so that way it's just not straight black. You can kind of see how the blending mode will affect your planet. And then I would just go through and do that for each planet. So I'm going to do this moon next. I'm going to hold Command or Control, click on the thumbnail, make a new layer, then make a mask. Then I'm going to select the layer and then just add my shadow. And this moon is kind of a little bit behind the planet, so I'm just going to add a bit of shadow to show that. And something that might be useful is you can put these in groups. So that way if you go to move them, it'll move as an entire asset. So I'll do that one more time. I'm doing it to this moon right here. I'm holding Command or Control, click the thumbnail, new layer, add a mask, and then I'm just painting on my shadow. And I'm going back to this planet shadow here because I have that planet right there, so I'm just going to add a shadow going directly behind the planet. So that way this moon is casting a shadow on it. That shadow's not going to go all the way back because it won't reach over the top of the curve completely. So that's why I'm not going directly back. I'm just adding a little bit of a shadow to imply that where that shape is in relation to this planet. Next, I want to shade this planet, but we're going to shade it a little differently than we did these because the way the light is set up is it's the light, the planet, us. So we're seeing mostly the backside of the planets, which aren't well lit, so it's mostly shadow. For this one over here, it's actually us, the light source, and then the planet. So we're mostly going to be seeing the lighter side of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the group that has that planet in it. I'm going to hit the thumbnail on the planet body and then on the solid ring. So I'm going to hit Command or Control on my keyboard, hit the first thumbnail, hold Shift, and I still have Command or Control down, and then I'm going to select the ring. You'll see it selects the entire thing, and then I can make a new layer, add a mask to it. Now I can go in and paint that shadow. Now rather than going around the entire edge of it like this, I'm just doing this top half because the light source is lower than the planet. So I'm just doing this. And the smudge tool is a great way to kind of smooth out your shading a bit and to move it around if you need to. Again, if you're painting and nothing's happening, just make sure you have the layer selected and not the mask. And then I'm just going to go in with my eraser and kind of fix the shading on the rings a bit, because these are flat planes, so the lighting is going to hit it a little differently compared to how it's hitting the planet. These are also a lot more gaseous than what my planet is. So to make sure I'm getting the ring, I'm just holding Command or Control, hitting the thumbnail on the solid ring, and then just going back and erasing all the black that was on the rings. I'm mostly aiming to get rid of some of the stray strokes on here. And I just want a little bit of shadow on the backs here. There. I think that looks good. So I'm really happy with how this turned out. I'm just going to save this and call it good. So yours doesn't have to look exactly like mine. You can play with the composition a little bit by either rotating the canvas from landscape to portrait and playing with that view. You can move some of the objects around. Just keep in mind where your light is coming from, and light travels in a straight line. So the sides that are closest to your light source are going to be lit up, and anything on the opposite side is going to be dark. So just keep that in mind. You can also play around with your extra object here. Rather than having the extra planet and moons like I added, you can have another supernova, you can add in a galaxy, you can have a comet or a spaceship shooting across the scene. Just kind of play with it until you get something that you'd be more than happy to display in your portfolio.